Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking and we are back with the ditch guy. Now, I've already made a video where I actually disagreed with some of his points, particularly when we were discussing Roman testudo, and some of you actually got really mad for some reasons. Some people think that the word disagree is an insult for some reasons. No, I actually liked the guy a lot. He sounds very proficient, he doesn't push politics, he's very good at what he does. It's just that the part where about the Roman testudo, I completely disagreed. A couple of his fanboys in the comments got really mad at me, and so I'm gonna make a dedicated video where I will defend, because I was right. I double-checked, triple-checked with the sources, I was absolutely right. But that's not what we are doing here today. What I was told by, once again, people that really like him, is that he's really good, specifically when talking about ancient Sparta. And so I'm fascinated by the topic, and I'm really looking forward to watch this video with you, because, once again, I liked him a lot. And if Sparta, rather than Rome, is his field of expertise and where he shines the most, well, I think that that's then what I want to watch. So let's check it out. Let's go.
Were the Spartans better than Athens? Better.
What a
and
question.
if they were both really sort of filled with pent-up desire, that they would have more vigorous sex and that therefore their children would be more energetic and stronger. They were not the best warriors of anything, but they were briefly a little bit better than other Greeks at least.
Okay, let's go, let's go. Bring in the facts.
So hello everyone, my name
Hi.
is Roel Konijnendijk. I'm an ancient historian at Lincoln College, Oxford. I specialize in Greek warfare and ancient Sparta, and I'm here to answer the most frequently Googled questions about the Spartans. All right, first question.
There was a worst possible image to represent the Spartans, but then again, of course, it's not on him, it's on the editor.
When did the Spartans live? It's a trick question. They still live now. Sparta has been refounded. It exists. But actually, when we're talking about ancient Sparta, it first emerged as a settlement around the 10th century BC. But when we're talking about historical Spartans, it's roughly between the 6th and 3rd century that they are the most significant. So between about 600 and 200 BC.
So I am actually making, and I've been producing a video on the origins of the Greeks, where we're going to go really, really ancient. Just wanted to mention it because it's going to happen soon.
Next question. Were the Spartans Greek?
Of course.
Yes. No two ways about it.
Yeah.
Some people like to argue that they were something weird to the other Greeks, that some Greeks talked about them as if they were almost foreigners or barbarians, and the Spartans themselves were quite sort of fearful of foreigners and tried to keep them out. But at the same time, I mean, in every sense, the Spartans are part of the Dorian Greek dialect group. They have Greek customs, they worship Greek gods.
Yeah, they're just city-states. So, of course, each city-state is going to be independent and have its own legislations, its own laws, its own culture. But isn't it the same even today? I mean, imagine for a second that we took the United States of America and for a moment pretend that they're not united. Someone from California, someone from New York, Texas, Alabama, Florida, North freaking Dakota. Monumentally different. They all speak English, but the culture, the history, the way they think in general, percentages when it comes to politics and variety of even the accents, if you see where I'm going. But we are all still Americans. Likewise, they're all still Greeks, even though there was no single united Greece.
They are in every sense a part of the wider Greek world, both in their culture and their language and everything else. So yes, the Spartans were Greek.
Yeah.
Next question. Were the Spartans a professional army?
Okay, so I've been wrong in the past, and I did repeat this, but I was wrong. And I'm sure he's going to say this now, but it's incorrect to call them professional, because even when I said professional soldiers, I shouldn't have used the term professional, because when you say professional in this period, then you're specifically comparing them to the Romans. And when you do that, then no, they were not professional. Let's see how the expert, though, because I'm sure he'll do a much better job than me. Let's see how he says it, so that in a way we can debunk me as well, because I've repeated this and it's technically wrong.
No. Despite what you may have heard, it's often said that the Spartans were the only professional soldiers in Greece, and that their army was the only professional army, that this makes them stand out from the rest of the Greek world. But no, the Spartans were not a professional army. Spartans could not possibly be professional soldiers because they were forbidden by law from having any profession. This was a very important part of Spartan life. Every single Spartiate citizen was a leisure class citizen who lived...
Yeah, they owned land.
lived off the proceeds of the land that they owned without having to work for it. They had a helot underclass, they had enslaved people to do the work for them, which allowed them to live the life of leisured gentlemen. If they couldn't afford that life, they were kicked out of the citizen body. So these are people who define themselves as people who don't have to work. They are large estate owners, and this puts them in a position where they can dispose of their time as they see fit. However, they did have an obligation to their community and the state. What that obligation was military service. So if war broke out, the Spartans called the...
And of course, being upper class, they could afford excellent gear, which usually it's what I was trying to debunk myself, but I sort of let the pendulum swing a bit too far. When I was mentioning, well, these people would have been professional, I only meant to say that they would have been proficient. That's the word I should have used. And also, it annoys me that in movies such as 300, even though that's based on a comic and it's not a historical documentary, but still we see these bodybuilders were naked, whereby they could have, because they were rich, they could have afforded excellent gear and been well armored. With that being said, I was wrong using the word professional, and I'm glad that now we are taking this opportunity to debunk me and let the expert, who is competent for a change, actually say the way it is. That's the most important thing. Always find out the truth.
Ban, as they called it. They brought in the militia, and then the army marched out. This is the same as the way it works in all the other Greek states.
All the other Greek states,
so the Spartans didn't have an army. They had a militia of leisure class citizens who only served in times of war, and as soon as war was over, the army came home and was promptly disbanded. There is no Spartan army in peacetime. There is no professional Spartan army.
Fantastic.
Were the Spartans the best warriors?
Yeah, it's on a similar note then. He's going to say no. As we saw at the very beginning, there was a period in which they were performing better, but in general, he's going to say no.
The best of what? I mean, sometimes this gets inflated into the idea that they are some of the best warriors in history because the way their society works, etc. They were clearly not. They really struggled to ever achieve anything at all.
Excellent to show the ancient Macedonian army instead. That would have been professional. That's another one. Apart from the Romans that we mentioned, Macedonians would have been professional.
Against a professional army, such as the Macedonians or the Romans.
I'm glad he said that. Imagine if it was like, oh, and by the way, only the Romans would have been professional. Macedonians is another myth. And I'm like, God damn it. I would have left it in, though, just to get the truth out. I don't get if I'm the one who gets debunked or someone else. Misspeaking, you get debunked. That's fair.
They are not able to really make a stand against anything that takes military organization more seriously than they do.
Yep.
On the other hand, within the world of the Greek city-states, where a lot of people didn't really prepare for war and were really only serving when they were called up, the Spartans had a few minor ways in which they organized and prepared their army a little bit better than other Greek states, which came through their upbringing and their exercises in peacetime, as well as the principles that they applied once the army had gathered for war. So there are a couple of organizational principles, an officer hierarchy, a unit breakdown, and a couple of features of Spartan discipline and obedience that made them a little bit better at fighting pitched battles, and they used that to good effect. This made them, on average, more effective in battle than other Greeks when they were fighting.
On average being the key.
Together, but individually there was nothing special about Spartans, and no Greek ever thinks that a Spartan is a better warrior, man for man than other Greeks. This is really just about the way the Spartans organized their army in the classical period after the Persian Wars, and it gave them a slight edge that allowed them to win a number of pitched battles. That is the entire foundation of their reputation. They were not the best warriors of anything, but they were briefly a little bit better than other Greeks at least.
Man, this guy's good. You were right. This guy's really good.
How did the Spartans train? This is an interesting one because it's something that I think a lot of modern people are very exercised about. Like, how can we try and figure out this training? Can we replicate it? What can we do with that? The fact is we do have a number of descriptions of the Spartan upbringing, which survive from the ancient...
I love the long hair, by the way. As a long-haired man, I love the fact that Spartans did have long hair. Unless the expert debunks that too. But for what I've read in the sources, they did have long hair and they were proud of it. The only reason why I would know that is because I'm a long-haired man. So I did research that one.
Ancient sources. They don't always agree, but at least we know a little bit about it. But we don't know very much about their training. We just know that from everything that we can tell, it's purely athletic. So Spartan training is just running, jumping, discus throwing, javelin throwing, wrestling, boxing, the kind of things that the Greek did to prepare for things like the Olympic Games, you know.
I mean, it makes sense because it will increase your endurance. Endurance is massive when it comes to marching, particularly if it's a long field battle, just performing at your best. It is massive.
Kind of contests that they did among each other. The Spartans trained this way in order to exercise their bodies, in order to increase their fitness, in order to make themselves better prepared for the hardships of campaigning.
Yeah.
But that is essentially the sum of their training. They didn't do any weapons training. They don't seem to have performed any formation drill until the armies were gathered. So this is a few days before they march out to war, perhaps, if that. And so the sum of their training...
Man, from a Roman perspective, that would have been so noob. Literally. Ask any Roman military man.
Is essentially just fitness and endurance. So this gets really distorted in a lot of understanding of the Spartan training. They think that this is very militarized. People tend to portray this as being constant training for war, constant training with weapons, but it wasn't that precisely aimed. The purpose of this training and the purpose of their education was to make sure that these people were ready to serve their community when they were called upon. So making sure they're fit so that they can serve in war, but also making sure they are obedient so that they follow orders, and making sure they respect the traditions and values of Sparta, so that when they make political decisions as well as personal decisions, they follow the norms and values of their society. And this was the main thing of the Spartan upbringing, is making them not into perfect warriors but into perfect citizens, making them good little Spartiates who are going to perpetuate the traditions. That's basically what Spartan training is for, and it's much less involved, or even not at all involved, with learning how to be a good fighter.
Combat.
Next.
What's up with that music, by the way?
Question: did the Spartans throw babies off cliffs?
I think that's a myth.
We don't know, but probably not. There's only one source that tells us that they did. It's a very late source. It's the Roman historian called Plutarch, or a historian who writes in the Roman period. He is the only one to ever mention this, about 600 years after the Spartans had their most prominent period. And no other contemporary source ever says this, and we do hear about disabled Spartans actually getting to grow up and live full lives. So we hear about Spartans.
It could be that it's something that they did at one point in the archaic period. They discontinued it, maybe like 1 or 2 generations. And so since it was such a staggering thing, then it remained, and then the Romans hear it, and then he repeats it. But then again, I do believe that the Romans did fact check. I absolutely believe that. So that's why I'm even giving the benefit of the doubt that maybe it did happen, and the Romans just heard some sources that they thought would have been valuable, like sources you can believe in, but it's also possible it was completely a myth. That's also possible. That's
Spartans who were apparently not thrown off cliffs. So the implication is very likely it actually wasn't a practice at the time when Sparta was at its height. Yeah. It may have been brought in later to complement other eugenic practices, but it probably wasn't a feature of their everyday life. They certainly didn't expect that this was going to happen to them.
Well, if he thinks it was later, I was postulating the possibility that it was archaic. If he thinks it's later, then, I mean, he's the expert.
They, if they had a child that turned out to be deformed or had some kind of disability, there was no understanding that this was a habitual thing that the Spartans did. Did the Spartans practice eugenics? Yes, so eugenics in a certain form. So this idea of trying to breed a better kind of Spartan. They certainly had various practices and laws that were intended to be eugenic. But they were not eugenic in a more modern sense where people tried to figure out who has the best genes or the best traits and then try to breed them in this very dodgy sort of early 20th century experiments. But rather in a way that reflects the scientific understanding of the age. So for instance, they believed that if both man and woman were strong, so physically trained and physically fit, then their children would also be stronger. So this is why they made women practice gymnastics as well, where they made them go and run and do other kind of
makes sense. I mean,
sports before they were married, so that they would be fit around the time they were married. And this is also why supposedly they kept young newlyweds apart. So they made sure that it was difficult for the man to see the woman, to visit the woman, for a newly married man to visit his wife, because they believed that if he had limited access to her, and if they were both really sort of filled with pent-up desire, that they would have more vigorous sex and that therefore their children would be more energetic and stronger. These are the kind of beliefs that the Spartans had. And so they're technically eugenic in the sense that they were trying to find the best possible matches and then trying to create the ideal conditions in which these would result in strong children. But they actually weren't really so sure about how genetics, well, obviously they had no concept of genetics. Yeah. They weren't necessarily sure about how you actually go about this. There are some examples where they have more concrete interference in the way that that Spartans formed families. So, for instance, one king who supposedly married a woman who was very short was reprimanded by the ephors, by the officials, because they said that he would have small children, he would have short children. So there was kind of an understanding that Spartans were supposed to marry in ways and seek connections, seek sexual relations.
And if you think about it, even though they may sound like, oh, that's so bad, because why couldn't the king marry whoever he loves? But then again, even in the medieval period, you think like the princesses and princes and the son of a duke, they could marry for love? I mean, that's one of the things. If your daughter, it's kind of a funny meme, but if your daughter asks you, hey, dad, treat me like a princess, then from a historical standpoint would be to marry her to the son of a powerful foreign kingdom in order to strengthen your military alliances.
In ways that would result in the strongest and biggest and fiercest and most noble children. But they went about this in different ways and they weren't necessarily entirely sure how best to do this. Next question. Were the Spartans encouraged to steal food? Yes, when they were young. Supposedly part of their upbringing that they didn't get enough food, so they had to steal the rest. Although they could also hunt, they did a lot of hunting, and they could also just go and ask their parents for some bonus food or whatever else. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which they complemented their diet, but one of the ways that they were encouraged to do was to try and steal food and get away with it, because they could prove their cunning. Next question.
Of course, not a huge fan of that, but it doesn't matter because I'm trying not to be modernist. Let's look at it in period.
Were the Spartans vegetarian? No, famously not. Spartans ate a lot more meat than other Greeks. This is one of the ways in which the Spartans, despite their image of austerity, actually were living a life of quite considerable luxury. They ate pork every day. Wow. The food that they eat was black broth, which was essentially pork stewed in pork blood.
Pass.
They ate meat and they had to slaughter pigs for their meals every day, where most other Greeks would not eat meat at all because it was too expensive.
I wonder though, do they need to slaughter pigs every day simply because they eat pork every day? Is there necessarily a correlation there? Because if you slaughter a pig, you turn it into sausages, the one pig that has been slaughtered and all the rest of other types of food. But I'm saying if then the meat gets conserved through salt, one pig will feed Spartans, I guess in this case, but people for quite a long time, in fact. Do they need to slaughter every single day?
Save those animals for the production of milk and cheese, or various other things you might get off them, like sheep for wool, and would only eat when such animals were sacrificed at religious festivals. So the Spartans ate an unusual amount of meat. And this was obviously also one of the ways in which you can bulk up, which is something the Greeks associated with an athletic lifestyle.
Yeah, of course, protein, high diet.
Next question. Were the Spartans better than Athens? Better. This is only one of the big questions that the Greeks were asking themselves. I mean, obviously it depends on what you want out of your society. Better for whom? Better in what way? The way that the Spartans portrayed, or the way that the Athenians portrayed it, the Spartans were better at organizing their society so that it was stable. What they appreciated about Sparta was that it had very little political turmoil, the system was very constant, and that it allowed...
Probably means also very well executed propaganda.
...them to essentially form their citizen children into the kind of people they like to see, this kind of moral conditioning, this upbringing that turned them into perfect little Spartiates. That is something that the Athenians admired about the Spartans. But on the other hand, the Athenians were the ones who produced most of the art and the rhetoric and the science that we know from ancient Greece.
Let me give you a little interesting fact. I'd like to now show you an image. I'll do it during editing of these statues how they most likely looked like in period, which would have been in full color.
Most of the art and the rhetoric and the science that we know from ancient Greece, and in a lot of ways are this prototype of the ancient Greeks that modern people still admire. And the reason why we know so much about the ancient Greeks is because it's Athenian materials for the most part.
That is true. It's the one city-state that we know the most about, including their political system.
Predominantly Athenian texts and Athenian architecture and Athenian ideas that survive to the present day. If you were a woman in one of these cities, you might think that Sparta is better if you're a citizen woman because you have slightly more freedom to run your own household.
Yeah, and own land. I think that's the only difference, in fact. Like this idea that Spartan women had more freedom, I honestly think it's only in the legislative sense that they were allowed to own land, whereas Greek women anywhere else weren't. But that's it. Not like they had this great freedom.
And you have slightly more of a legal personhood, whereas in Athens you're very much subject to the men in your life.
I still think also in Sparta you would be subject to the men in your life.
But it depends. If you are an enslaved woman in Athens or Sparta, it might not make much difference.
Yeah.
So there are all sorts of different ways you can approach this question.
Very good.
And I don't necessarily think that we want to pronounce on one being better than the others in any categorical sense. All right, next question. Did Sparta have a navy? Yes. Quite a small navy, but they always did have one. They had dockyards at Githaion, south of the city.
So did Rome. The only reason why I'm saying this is because it's a myth. The idea that the Romans didn't have a navy were horrible, and I have addressed it on a few videos. Links in the description.
At Salamis, they had 17 ships. And later on, they briefly had a naval empire, although most of the ships were not Spartan. They were provided by their subject allies and largely funded by the Persians, but they did have a navy. Next question. Why didn't Sparta have walls?
Yeah, that's a good one. The walls of men. Let's see if he goes deeply into that.
Sparta famously was one of the last Greek states to build walls.
Yep.
Walls had become common by the late Archaic or early Classical period. Most of these states were trying to fortify. The Spartans refused to do this. They themselves said that it was because they're too manly for any of that nonsense. They will fight, their men will go out and fight, and that's all the walls they need. But in practice, I mean, firstly, Sparta consists of a conglomeration of villages which are quite far apart. Like there's quite a bit of distance around that area. So building a wall would have been very expensive. It would have been
That's a very interesting way to put it. I never thought of it that way.
very long building work. It would have been a very substantial endeavor. So maybe
Budget-wise, yeah, that would have been problematic.
they didn't have the funds to do it. And secondly, Sparta was already around the time that city was spreading around the Greek world, was essentially a hegemon over quite a large area of subject allies. So to a large extent, they didn't need a wall because their enemies weren't close to their borders.
I think that's the best way. Yeah, I like this explanation much more than the budget one, because it doesn't matter. Like, yeah, it could be expensive and it's difficult logistically, engineeringly, from an engineering point of view, because the 5 towns, they're kind of spread, sure. But if you are in need, like if there is a threat at your borders, you will build that wall. You will find the budget. You'll freaking tax them dry to build that wall if you really need it. So I think his second point is his strongest, and I absolutely agree with it. It must have been that they didn't need it, and now he's going into why when it comes to that. And that's fantastic because, of course, again, he's very, very competent.
So they could get away with not having one because they essentially had huge amount of buffer zone before any enemy would ever get near them. So unlike other Greek states, they persisted without a wall.
Very well.
Next
very
question.
well explained.
Did the Spartans hunt their slaves? So the Spartans had the Helot population, which was a huge enslaved underclass, which I've already mentioned. They had this organization called the Crypteia, the Hidden, which was essentially a couple of youths who were coming to the age of adolescence, who were occasionally sent into the wild, initially apparently just to survive, but in later periods apparently to terrorize the Helots. And one of their jobs was essentially to hunt them, to kill any of the ones that they wanted, that they saw. Ideally, they were supposed to be the strongest and most sort of dangerous.
I see. Let me see what else. So we've got, did the Spartans get their slaves drunk? Not interested. Did the Spartans have a king? Yes. Was Sparta a democracy? No, because they had kings. I mean, I want to see how he addresses that one. So we're going to watch this one about democracy. Why did the Spartans fight at Thermopylae? Well, because they said they had an allegiance, like they made a promise about it. Why did the Spartans only send 300? 300 Spartans is correct, but there were a lot more men from other areas. Were the Spartans betrayed? Yes. Did the Spartans beat the Persians? Were the Spartans muscular? What a question. The Spartans have long hair. Oh, he's got it. He's got it. Spartans have same-sex relationship. We're going to watch this one as well. So you're not going to watch everything. As usual, I want to encourage you to click the link in the description or the pinned comment below to go watch the original video. But we're going to watch first the democracy. Then we'll watch 300. Same-sex. Let's go.
Next question. Was Sparta a democracy? Weirdly, a question that comes back a lot because no, it wasn't. It definitely wasn't. What are you talking about? But
Athens was.
The idea of Sparta is, to a lot of Greek philosophers, to political thinkers, it was an example of what they call a mixed constitution. It had the monarchy element with the two kings. It had the oligarchy element with the gerousia, a few rich men in charge. And then it had a democratic element with an assembly of all citizens. So they said it has a mix of these things. And of course,
it's mostly a kingdom with a strong oligarchic component. I personally don't see any democracy, even in the purest form of democracy, which was the Athenian democracy, rather than being representative.
When there's an assembly of all citizens making decisions, then arguably it's a form of democracy. And some ancient sources double down on this and say, look, it actually works quite democratically. They all get together and make decisions. That's what we call democracy, isn't it? But the thing is, the fact we always have to remember about Sparta is in order to be a Spartan citizen, you had to meet a property requirement. I've already mentioned this, right?
There we go. So it is only the wealthy.
To meet a certain level of wealth in order to be a citizen, in order to be part of these assemblies. Yeah. And so there was already a property requirement for citizenship, which means that that democratic element is still oligarchy.
Yeah.
This is how the Greeks...
He is absolutely right.
Defined an oligarchy is that there is a property requirement for full citizenship. You need to have a certain amount of wealth in order to count as a citizen. And
man, I really feel like I'm learning a lot today.
Sparta absolutely worked that way, which means Sparta was not a democracy. Next question. Why did the Spartans fight at Thermopylae? Because they had agreed to do so as part of the Council of Allies that were fighting against the Persians. It was a council that...
Even in the movie you see that, and the movie is not historically accurate, but you don't even need to read the sources and study the history, because even in the movie there is the whole oracle thing, but even in the movie you see that.
The Athenians sent the fleet to Artemision nearby to fight the Persian fleet, and the Spartans led the allied army to Thermopylae. That was the agreement because Thermopylae is a bottleneck. That's where you fight the Persian army. It was a common decision, and they followed that order. And they sent their troops north, along with those of their allies. Next question. Why did the Spartans only send 300 men to Thermopylae? Presumably, I don't know, it's implied. They sent 300 men in a couple of other occasions, but we'll go with that. They didn't, first of all, they sent 1,000 men.
Okay. To be specific, 300 of those were Spartans and the rest were not.
300 of them may have been full Spartan citizens.
Yeah.
They also sent a bunch of their allies along. So the Greeks themselves told of 4,000 men from the Peloponnese.
Yep.
And then local populations obviously joined in this fight because they knew that it was their last defense against the Persian advance. So Phocians and Locrians and Boeotians were also there, which meant the total force was maybe 6,000 or 7,000.
Could you imagine that? Never mind 300.
Now, why did the Spartans send so few? That is actually unknown. They themselves said that it was because the rest of the army was prevented because there was a religious festival. But we know that
that sounds like an excuse.
Army left long before the religious festival kicked off. So later on, when the 1,000 arrived at Thermopylae and Laconia said, actually, I might need some more men, he called for reinforcements, but the Spartans said, no, we have this religious festival. So it prevented them from sending reinforcements, but it didn't prevent them from sending the initial army. The other excuse they offered was that they had received an oracle that said these men just had to die as a sacrifice in order to save the rest of Sparta. But a lot of people now think of this as a story that's a little bit too neat. They don't really believe that. It's something that
sounds like a post-fact. I can't think of a way to express it, but it sounds like, yeah, after the fact, now you say it. Because you know that they died and you know what happened. That's what it sounds like.
That sounds like it's made up after the fact.
Yeah.
In practice, it seems very likely that the Spartans were only willing to commit about 1,000 men to a fight so far away from home when they preferred.
Makes sense. Okay, long hair, let's go.
Next question. Did the Spartans have long hair? Yes, they took pride in it. They thought it made them look fearsome.
It's not a myth. Ditch guy confirmed it. Long hair.
They also used that as an example of their leisure class lifestyle. It was very common among the Greeks that having long hair showed that you didn't have to work. It didn't get in the way of you having to do manual labor. Because you're rich, you grew your hair long to show off your wealth. So the Spartans took pride because they're all leisure class citizens.
Man, if a Spartan saw this, wait, where does it reach? There we go. Is that long enough for you Spartans? Huh? Oh, that's funny. Anyways, thank you, Ditch Man, for confirming that. I'm glad you didn't debunk me on that one. I've said it a few times.
In their long hair, and they took care of it. They combed it before battle, they oiled it, they made it look shiny and beautiful, in order to impose on their enemies that they were indeed leisure class citizens who were free to devote themselves to, serving their community in war. So they took pride in that. They took pride in their appearance and especially their long hair. Next question. Did the Spartans have same-sex relationships? Yes, very much so. It's even been theorized that it was an essential part of Spartan citizen life. Spartans, when they grew up to adulthood, had to become part of one of the mess groups, one of the tent groups. These were exclusive groups, and the only way to get in was to be elected a new member by all the existing members. They had to be unanimous. If you couldn't get into a mess group, you lost your citizenship status. So this was existential for them. They lost all of their status and privileges if they couldn't get in. So the easiest way to do that was essentially to, as a boy, as an adolescent, to build a relationship with one of the adult Spartiates who was already in one of these groups, and to use that connection to be invited in, to basically be invited as the lover of one of the existing members to be acceptable to the rest of the group.
I don't know if lover is the correct term though, because it may make it a little anachronistic. But anyways, I don't want to straw man him, so let's go.
Say, yeah, that person is clearly okay. That person is somebody we know intimately, to put it lightly. And so the Spartans had same-sex relationship. They made it a part of the way they organized their society. And there are many remarks to this effect. We know of several historical characters who were either completely besotted with particular boys that they met on campaign in Asia Minor or wherever else, or who were in relationships with each other and used that for leverage. For instance, there was somebody who tried to petition a Spartan king because his son was the lover of the king's son. So these kind of anecdotes that show how much these relationships were absolutely a part of Spartan society. And often it should be noted, these are not necessarily pederastic in the sense that they are between an adult man of advanced age and a young boy. Often the age gap between them was not that great. They might be between a boy of about 17, 18 and a man in his early 20s. So there was only a gap of a few years between them because that was the time at which, these men were considered to be most attractive, but also when they were supposed to find a sponsor to get them ahead in life.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying, like, the term lover, as he says, it's basically you're trying to bribe with sex people who had power in order to get that power. So it's not the same as, for example, two men who begin a relationship in the modern sense. It's still very different, and not to mention there is this stigma associated in the classical period associated to who was the male in the dominant part into the relationship. Like, it's still very different. He didn't say this here, kind of want to add it, but I've said it so many times, I'm not going to go into the details. I'll say just refer to one of my million videos where I describe the concept of same-sex attraction in the classical period from the classical lenses. Because when we hear this, one way to, it's not that he said anything wrong, but I'm just saying when we hear this, we might think, oh, okay, so basically you had gay couples and they were accepted and respected, and then everybody was open-minded. No, it depends, it varies. He's only talking about Sparta, of course. This would change depending on the period, and in reality, in periods there were people that were strongly against this. There were people that were okay with it, and I still think, do remember, when we talk about this, we're not talking about, these instances pertain to the upper class. They do not pertain to the entirety of the population. This idea that in ancient Greece, people were free to love who they want and marry who they want, it's nonsense. These are specific elements that have to do with aristocracy, people in power, and it does not have to do with the general population. I think the majority of people in ancient Greece, whether it be Sparta, whether it be Athens, didn't care about this idea of same-sex love or same-sex relationships. They just cared about farming the land, doing the job, go to the well, get the food, come back home. And what the aristocrats were doing didn't matter to them. They didn't even think about it. That's what I think. And then when we read the sources, we see that, as I say, some people are vehemently against this, some people don't care, some people support it. It's very varied. That degree of variance in the way people thought about same-sex attraction and same-sex relationships is the only true context that can be given when it comes to this. And if you don't do that, then we're going to go into politics. But up to this point, I think he just decided to touch the surface, and that's fine. It's his prerogative. Just wanted to clarify. Okay, but I think that kind of ends, because then, were Spartan women equal? That's a really good one. Although then again, I can give you the answer. Spartan women were not equal. In fact, let me just see the beginning of that.
Whereas these young men who were not yet married were seeking some kind of sexual partnership. So there is a reason why there's a place for this in Spartan society that makes it very integral to the way Spartan society worked. Were the Spartan women equal? Now, I've already talked about this briefly. I mean, there is an understanding that Spartan women had more rights in Spartan society, citizen women at least, than they did elsewhere in the Greek world. This is clearly legally true. Spartan women could own property, which we know because Athenians thought this was a big problem. This is one of the things that the Spartans really did wrong in their society, supposedly. So Spartan women were able to amass wealth of their own and thereby to establish themselves in society as, people of power, people of means. And some of them even did really stereotypical rich guy things like sponsoring chariot teams. The first Olympic victor who was a woman was a Spartan woman, a Spartan princess who funded a chariot team for the Olympic Games. So you have these prominent women who are throwing their weight around, throwing their wealth around and using it for social power, using it to get glory for the city and to influence politicians, influence Spartan citizens who are actually making the political decisions. Also, when they're younger, of course, they have the freedom to do things like sports, stuff like that. On the other hand, we mustn't necessarily believe that this makes them the equals of men. I mean... Exactly.
That would be very anachronistic and modern. And I appreciate that he's doing that, he's saying that and specifying it, because if you just leave it at that, then people are going to say, look, there was equality between men and women in Sparta, and that's absolute nonsense.
When you say equal, this is really... the answer must be no, because Spartan women still had no political rights. They weren't allowed to vote in the assembly. They weren't allowed to become members of the council. They weren't allowed to become ephors. They had no political voice. Their only power was informal, soft power, influencing men.
Exactly.
Who could then influence politics. So there's no way in which Spartan women were equal to men. And similarly, all of the kind of licenses that were given to Spartan women, there is a dark side to that, which is often snowed under when people say, oh, in their upbringing, they were so free, they could criticize men, they could go out and do sports and all that kind of thing. Firstly, it made them objectified in the eyes of non-Spartans, who were very lecherously interested in all these Spartan women doing sports outside, wearing these revealing clothing and all these kind of things. So there's a lot of lecherous sort of attention paid to this kind of thing, which we should be suspicious of. But the other thing is that when it's described in our sources as something that Spartan women did, it's explicitly noted that they did this in part, not just to prepare for marriage and be fit, as I've mentioned, but also to essentially put themselves on show for the men. Like they were going out to display their bodies and display their abilities so that the men watching, as Plutarch puts it, would start thinking about marriage. Now that's a really nice euphemism when you put it that way, but obviously what that means is these women, it's a meat show, right? This is a cattle show. These women are...
I mean, I don't know, ditch guy, I mean, sure, but it seems like they still chose to do. I mean, at the end of the day, sexual attraction between the sexes is a thing. This is still ancient Greece, let's remember.
Are brought out in order to display themselves and put themselves at the mercy of these men because...
But the men displayed themselves too. In the Olympics, they did it naked.
Because their purpose within Spartan society is A, to transfer wealth through marriage, and B, to produce Spartan sons. And those things are very similar to the role of women in other Greek societies, and they mean that a lot of these freedoms, they really have a dark side, and they also aren't nearly as comprehensive as they're sometimes described.
Fair. Okay, noble ones. Well, I really enjoyed the video. I feel like I learned a lot, which is fantastic, and it's not something I can always say when it comes to experts, whether it be history hit, whether it be insider and whatnot. But anyways, this guy, very well done, very good job. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. Bye.